Welcome to NightStoryX Fear, where every whisper hides a secret and every story leaves a scar. If you dare to listen, then like, share, and subscribe before the darkness takes you. And tell us in the comments what haunts you the most. NightStoryX Fear, where fear never sleeps.
Story 1. The Spanish Moss Witness. Savannah, Georgia. Location: a private historic carriage house in Savannah's historic district. The air in Savannah, even in late October, was thick and heavy, smelling of jasmine and salt marsh. For their wedding night, Amelia and Ryan bypassed the grand hotels, choosing instead a restored 18th century carriage house tucked behind iron gates on Jones Street. It had original heart pine floors, exposed brick, and a massive four-poster bed draped in white linen, a sanctuary of old Southern charm and absolute privacy. The exhaustion of the day, the vows, the laughter, the endless champagne hit them simultaneously. They stumbled upstairs, the scent of Amelia's gardenia perfume mixing with Ryan's cologne. The process of shedding their formal wear was a slow, loving ritual. Ryan gently unzipped the intricate lace of her gown, kissing the soft skin of her back as the heavy fabric slid to the floor. Later, they stood together in the soft bathroom light, sharing quiet whispers and the first truly private embraces of their married life. The vulnerability of that moment, stripped down to their deepest, tired affection, was their greatest treasure. Ryan was already asleep, his arm draped possessively over her waist, before Amelia finished washing off her makeup. She lay beside him, the room lit only by the distant amber glow filtering through the shears. His steady, warm presence was comforting, a solid anchor against the ancient quiet of the house. That's when she heard it. A soft, wet thump from the corner of the room. She froze. It happened again, closer. It sounded like something heavy and damp hitting the wooden floor, followed by the faint scrape of something dragging. "Ryan?" she whispered, attempting to stir him, but his breathing was deep and even. She squinted into the darkness. Where the light hit the wall, she saw a shadow. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to be draped in something long and fibrous, like the Spanish moss outside, but moving. It wasn't walking, it was oozing its way along the baseboards toward the bed. A chilling thought struck her. In Savannah, they say the Spanish moss only grows on trees where a life ended tragically. The entity reached the foot of the bed. Now Amelia could hear the movement clearly, a subtle, sticky sound like a slug crossing glass. A faint, low, shuddering sigh came from right beside her ear. She turned her head an inch. Ryan's eyes were open, but they weren't looking at her. They were wide, milky white, and fixed on the ceiling. His mouth was slightly agape, revealing teeth she felt were too long, too sharp. His arm, still heavy on her waist, suddenly tightened with a grip that bruised. "Welcome to the family," a voice whispered from his throat, but it wasn't Ryan's voice. It was dry and brittle, like old leaves crushing together. "I've been waiting for the new owner of the veil." She screamed and scrambled off the bed, stumbling over the discarded dress. She hit the floor and crab-walked backward, her eyes locked on her husband, whose face was still partially buried in the pillow where they had shared such tenderness just an hour before. Ryan, or the thing wearing his face, didn't move. It simply lifted a hand and reached toward her face, its fingers unnaturally extended, long and thin like dried twigs. As the hand moved into the patch of light, she saw it was coated not in dirt, but in a fine gray silken cobweb, the same fibrous material that covered the shadowy shape that had crawled to the bed. It reached for the single gold wedding band glinting on her finger. She scrambled out the door and down the grand staircase, the image of her husband's vacant, possessed eyes burned into her mind. When she reached the iron gates and looked up at the window, the amber light was gone. All she saw was the dark, draped silhouette of the Spanish moss, hanging and swaying, waiting for its next witness.
Story 2. The Sound of Silence. Olympic National Forest, Washington. Location: a modern, glass-fronted rental cabin deep within the Pacific Northwest rainforest. Liam and Sarah had chosen a wedding night location that defined isolation. A minimalist cube-shaped cabin, all glass and cedar, perched on a steep slope overlooking a ravine in the Olympic Peninsula wilderness. The idea was absolute privacy, surrounded only by the deep, primeval green of the forest. The huge windows offered a magnificent, if slightly intimidating, view of the wild, dark trees. After the long day, they shed their formal constraints with eager anticipation. The luxury of the moment wasn't just the cabin, it was the intense, shared relief of finally being alone. They spent a quiet, intimate hour, savoring soft kisses and the promise of a night that was entirely their own. Liam settled onto the couch, watching the play of the firelight on Sarah's skin as she scrolled through wedding photos, her head resting on his shoulder, utterly content. The night was intensely dark. With no light pollution, the woods pressed in, a black wall against the illuminated comfort of their sleek, expensive room. The silence was overwhelming, a silence that broke only by the crackle of the gas fireplace and the low whisper of the wind moving through the ancient trees. Then, silence changed. It wasn't a sound that started, but a sound that stopped. The wind died completely. The crackle of the fire seemed to dim. The entire forest outside held its breath. The air went suddenly heavy, and the warmth of the room felt thick and suffocating. Liam looked up. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what? The quiet?" Sarah asked, putting her phone down, sensing his sudden tension. She felt her muscles tighten as the comfortable intimacy of the moment evaporated. the wind. It just vanished. He walked to the full-length glass wall. The reflection of their room was perfect on the dark glass. He leaned in, cupping his hands around his eyes to peer out, past the reflections. The trees were motionless. The darkness was absolute. But then, out in that darkness, something moved. It was slow, upright, and seemed to move with a strange, unnatural fluidity, like water slowly poured from a high distance. It was impossibly tall, and its outline was too distorted to be human. It had arms that swung low, nearly scraping the forest floor, and a head that looked too small for its huge, hunched body. "Liam?" breathed Liam, stepping back, pulling her close. "Don't look, just put the phone down and move away from the glass." As if responding to his fear, the thing stopped. It was about 50 feet away, partially obscured by an enormous Douglas fir. It stood, simply watching the glowing rectangle of their intimate space. Then, slowly, agonizingly, it turned its head toward the cabin. Sarah felt a rush of cold air as she realized the glass wall was the only thing separating them from the raw, wet wildness outside. The creature began to mimic. From the deepest part of the woods, a sound drifted toward them. It was a distorted, halting attempt at human speech. "Honey?" It sounded like Sarah's voice, but pitched down 3 octaves, wet and hollow, like speaking through a windpipe made of wood. The mimicry continued, using fragments of their wedding vows and promises exchanged earlier that night. "Liam? Where are you? The ring. I can't find the ring." Suddenly, the dark silhouette outside raised one of its long, dangling arms and pointed a thin, knobby finger directly at the glass where Sarah stood, at the spot where she had been resting her head on Liam's shoulder moments before. And then the creature smiled. The smile was not on its face. It was a ripple in the fabric of the darkness, a momentary widening of the shadow where its mouth should be, revealing what looked like a wet gray membrane. It was a smile of possession. Liam grabbed Sarah and pulled her toward the bedroom, fumbling for the lock. As they hit the floor, they heard a sound that split the silence of the forest, the sharp, violent crack of the glass wall splintering, followed by a soft, scraping sound as something inhumanly large began to squeeze through the opening, inviting itself into their private night.
Story 3. The Gift of the Grizzgree. Location: a haunted boutique hotel room in the French Quarter. Chloe and David's wedding was a vibrant celebration, fueled by the music and warmth of New Orleans. For the wedding night, David's eccentric elderly Aunt May insisted on providing a traditional gift for their suite: a small, intricate box tied with purple ribbon. Inside, resting on red velvet, was a small, crudely carved wooden doll, its face painted with a fixed, mournful expression, and a small, dried claw tied around its waist. "It's a grizzgree," Aunt May had whispered, her eyes dark and serious. "To ward off the hungry ones. Keep it under your pillow." They laughed it off in the grand suite, the scent of magnolia and jasmine thick in the air. Their first hour
was spent in quiet, shared awe. The soft brush of his hands on her waist, the lingering closeness that was finally unrestrained. They toasted to their future, the champagne cooling their flushed skin. Before they finally succumbed to exhaustion, Chloe, unsettled by the deep history of the city, placed the grisgri on the bedside table. Hours later, Chloe awoke in total darkness, suffocating heat and the stench of decay. The luxurious sheets were gone, replaced by damp, rough material. Her pillow was heavy and wet. She was alone. "David," she called out, her voice cracking. She could hear him, but it wasn't the sound of sleeping. It was a frantic, muffled scraping coming from within the walls behind the headboard, a space that had been silent moments ago when they had been resting there together. Suddenly, the room was flooded with a sickly green light. The temperature plummeted. The walls were covered not in wallpaper, but in old, peeling newspapers dated 1890. She was no longer in a luxury suite. In the center of the room, standing over a wash basin, was David, but he was not wearing his tuxedo. He wore a heavy, blood-soaked linen shirt and dark trousers. His hands were clasped, and he was staring into the basin with a look of utter, desperate horror. His body was tense, rigid, nothing like the soft, relaxed man who had held her just hours prior. "David, what is this?" Chloe pleaded, scrambling out of the bed, which was now a straw mattress. He didn't look at her. He spoke in a flat, monotone voice, reciting something in French Creole she didn't understand, ending with the chilling words, "The sacrifice must be paid." A sound like dry leaves rustling came from the shadows in the corner, then a low, wet moan. Chloe saw it. A woman, thin and pale, her dress tattered and dark with what looked like old swamp water. She was chained by the ankles to the wall, her face obscured by long, matted black hair. "It's his line," she wheezed, her voice sounding like sand rubbed together. "His family paid for this land with me. Now he must pay the interest." David finally turned. His eyes were milky and unseeing. He raised his hands, and Chloe saw he was holding a knife, an old, rusted butcher knife. He took a step toward her, not toward the chained woman, toward her. "He's giving them a replacement," the chained woman wheezed, a terrible, hopeless sob escaping her lips. "He's offering the new bride. It's always the new bride." Chloe screamed, backing away until her spine hit the cool, unfamiliar surface of the wall. David moved quickly, not with rage, but with a horrifying, mechanical necessity. Just as the cold steel brushed her cheek, she felt a sharp, tiny prick in her palm. The wooden grisgri doll had fallen off the bedside table, and her hand had closed around the sharp end of the dried claw. The green light vanished, the coldness retreated. Chloe found herself gasping, sitting upright in the plush hotel bed. David was lying next to her, stirring. "What is it, honey?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Nothing," she choked out, running a shaky hand over his chest, assuring herself of his familiar warmth. She looked over at the bedside table. The intricately carved wooden doll was gone. In its place was a small pile of purple ribbon and red velvet dust, and on the back of David's neck, just visible above the collar of his shirt, was a dark, fresh, perfectly round puncture mark, a sign that the exchange, however temporary, had been made.
Story 4. The Vellum Bride, Route 66, New Mexico. The blizzard in the Rockies had descended upon their travel plans with cruel speed. Trapped between nowhere and less than nowhere in New Mexico, Ben and Jessica pulled their rental off the highway when they saw a flickering neon sign. The Sands Motel. Vacancy. The place was a single-story ruin, the paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The air in room 7 smelled of dust, mold, and something sickeningly sweet, like crushed petals. But they were safe from the snow, and it was their wedding night. They tried to make the best of it. The cold, sterile room pushed them together, seeking warmth and comfort. They shared a paper cup of lukewarm champagne and a long, slow kiss, finding passion in the desolate surrounding. The contrast between the rough decay of the room and the intimacy of their shared future made the moment feel intensely private and necessary. Jessica found herself clinging to Ben, drawing strength from his presence against the oppressive atmosphere. As they finally prepared to settle in, Jessica noticed the sheets on the bed. They were not white. They were an aged, brittle yellow-brown, stretched taut over the lumpy mattress. Ben went to lock the door. "This lock is useless," he muttered. "The bolts stripped." Jessica shivered, wrapping herself in a thin, scratchy blanket. "It feels like we're sleeping inside a forgotten book." The real terror began when Ben used the bathroom. He let out a choked gasp. "Jess, come look at this!" Inside the small, grimy bathroom, the mirror was entirely covered in a thick layer of dust. Ben had wiped away a circle with his palm, but what was revealed wasn't a reflection of his face. It was a reflection of a different man, a gaunt, pale man in a high-collared 1940s-style suit, staring back with an intense, desperate longing, his eyes focused on Jessica in the doorway. Ben abandoned the mirror and returned to the room, grabbing the champagne. "Let's just get some rest." They lay down, trying to ignore the creaks and sighs of the old building. They held each other close, seeking refuge in the comfort of touch. Jessica closed her eyes, but a vivid image flashed behind her lids. The man from the mirror, standing right beside the bed, his head cocked, watching their intimacy. She opened her eyes to see Ben staring at her, but his expression was unnerving. It was a look of cold, scholarly appraisal. His gaze traveled over her body with an unsettling detachment entirely different from the loving passion of moments earlier. "The texture is incredible," he whispered, running a thumb lightly across her cheekbone. "Like very fine, aged vellum. Perfect preservation." "Ben, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "We need a record,"
he murmured. "The preservation here is simply unique. I need to make a rubbing." He reached to the bedside table, not for a lamp, but for a piece of charcoal and a large flat sheet of the yellow-brown bedsheet material. He leaned over her, his breath stale and cold. The familiar scent of his cologne was replaced by the cloying sweetness of crushed petals. "Don't worry," he said, his voice now dry and raspy, the voice of the man from the mirror. "It's painless. You'll just become part of the document." He pressed the coarse fabric onto her arm, holding the charcoal, and began to run it over the sheet, making a terrible scratching sound that echoed the cries of the woman trapped within the vellum sheet. Jessica fought, screaming silently into the pillow, realizing the sheets weren't sheets at all, but the preserved, flattened skins of the motel's previous victims. The Sands Motel. Not sand, but skins. And now her husband was joining the collection, trading their intimate vows for an eternal document.
Story 5. The Tides Keeper. Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Location: a secluded cliffside keeper's cottage on the outer banks of Cape Cod. Elias and Sophie rented a tiny weather-beaten cottage clinging to the cliffs near Provincetown. It was historic, smelled of sea salt and old smokewood, and offered a spectacular, terrifying view of the Atlantic. They had escaped the boisterous reception for this raw, solitary passion against a backdrop of natural fury. A powerful nor'easter had been brewing offshore all week, and by their wedding night, it had arrived. The cottage shook under the assault of wind and rain. Below them, the ocean roared, waves crashing against the granite with a sound like cannon fire. They found themselves drawn into the wild energy of the storm, holding each other tightly, the thunder and wind acting as a private, external rhythm to their excitement. The scent of salt and rain filled the room as they shared intense, prolonged embraces, reveling in the feeling of being utterly alone in the face of the elements. Sophie was trying to calm her nerves, savoring a quiet moment, when she noticed Elias wasn't in the room. "Elias?" she called, stepping into the small kitchen. He was standing at the window overlooking the cliff, the stormlight flashing in his eyes. He wasn't looking at the chaos of the ocean. He was looking at the lighthouse, now decommissioned about a quarter-mile down the beach. "It's on," he said, his voice flat. "The light." She peered out. Through the sheets of rain, a faint, rhythmic green flash cut through the night. "That's impossible," Sophie said. "That light hasn't worked in 50 years. Elias didn't respond. He simply walked to the front door, his trousers soaking up the water that had seeped under the threshold. His movements were slow and deliberate, utterly unlike the eager man she had been with minutes ago. "Where are you going?" Sophie demanded, her fear spiking. "I have to answer the call," he said, opening the door against the furious wind. He seemed unaware of the cold. "They are waiting for the keeper." Sophie rushed forward and grabbed his arm.
It was shockingly cold, like grasping a statue. "Elias, stop! This is insane! Close the door!" He looked at her, and for the first time she saw that his pupils were unnaturally dilated, black swallowing the blue. His skin was pale and slick, beaded with moisture that wasn't rain. He wrestled the door shut, locking the thick deadbolt. Elias turned on her, his breathing shallow and quick. He stared at her with a look of intense obligation, his affection utterly replaced by a primal need to obey. "You can't stop the tide, Sophie," he whispered, taking a step toward her. As he moved, she noticed something terrible. His shoes were covered in sand and thick black mud, though he hadn't left the house since the ceremony. And his tuxedo jacket was dark, glistening with seawater. He lunged for the door again, scratching at the wood. The desperation in his eyes was not his own. It was the panic of a drowning man clawing for the surface. Then, from the wooden floorboards beneath their feet, a loud, sustained rap echoed. Then another, and another, perfectly timed to the rhythmic flash of the distant green light. It sounded like a heavy, waterlogged fist knocking from the crawl space below. The knocking grew furious. The floorboards began to flex, and the smell of the sea, a raw, icy, fishy stench, rose up around them, replacing the perfume and wine. Elias stopped scratching the door and stood stock still, his head tilted. He was listening to the wood. "They're impatient," he said, a look of serene terror washing over his face. He walked to the window overlooking the sea, reached out and smashed his hand straight through the glass pane. The wind screamed into the room. Before she could move, Elias was scrambling out the jagged opening, throwing his body into the storm and onto the slippery, angled cliffside path. The last thing she saw was the green light pulse reflecting perfectly off the surface of the rising tide. And then a massive wave crashed over the path, pulling Elias into the darkness. But not before she saw the silhouettes of 3 other figures, tall, slender, and glistening wet, rising from the surf to meet him, claiming the payment for the precious time he had stolen for their intimate night.